Okay, so far we have discussed what a servlet is, we've discussed why do you use a servlet, and we've also discussed how communication takes place between the client and the servlet. So now we are going to have a look at the servlet lifecycle. We are going to see what the different lifecycle methods of a servlet are, what the different states of a servlet are, and when are these methods called. Okay. So basically there's only one state for a servlet, and that is the initialized state. Okay. So a does not exist state is merely a void state. It's not a state in real terms. Okay, so let's discuss how the state moves from does not exist to initialized, and then how the servlet state is again changed from initialized to does not exist. So when the first request for the servlet comes in, the constructor and the init method are called on the servlet. So only once in the lifetime of a servlet the constructor and init method are called. And once the init method is called, the servlet moves from does not exist to the initialized state. So the servlet is now initialized and ready to be used by other requests, other clients, right? So for every subsequent request that comes in, the service method is called and the servlet still stays in the initialized state, okay? And when the destroy method is called, the servlet again goes back from the initialized state to the does not exist state. And all these methods are basically called by the web container or the servlet engine. We'll see in the later slides when are these methods called and how are they called and what's the use of it. Okay, right. So this is the servlet hierarchy. So where your servlet behavior comes from, you can see the sketch here, right? So at the top of this hierarchy you have a servlet interface, okay, and generic servlet implements this servlet interface. It's actually an abstract class, and if you do not override the init method, if you don't have any initialization code in your servlet, you don't override the init method. So when you do not override the init method, it takes the default implementation from the generic servlet, right? Now HTTP servlet extends the generic servlet, and this again is an abstract class. Here if you do not override the service method, the default implementation from HTTP servlet is taken, right? And in the end, your servlet. This is the servlet which you code in. The servlet class which you actually write should should extend the HTTP servlet, and this is a concrete class. And this is the place where you implement your HTTP methods. That is either do get or do post, right? Okay. So let's now discuss the different methods of the servlet and the details about these methods, like when are they called and what is used for and all those different things, right? So first, the init method. When is the init method called? So the init method is called before any request for the servlet can be handled, right? So even before any client requests can be served, the init method is called, and this is called by the web container or the servlet engine, right? So what do you write in the service method? This is used to initialize your servlet before handling any client request. So initialization can be something like initializing your data source to connect to your database or any other such initializations you want to perform. And this initialization, what do you mean by initialization? Initialization is something that is a one-time process. You don't want every time for every client request, you don't want this particular thing to happen, so you put that code in the initialization block, right? So it happens only once in the lifetime of a servlet. Okay, so now a question may come up saying that you do have a constructor for a servlet, right? And generally when you talk about Java, you put all your initialization stuff in the constructor of the class. So why do you have a special method called the init method for initialization? Why can't you do the initialization in the constructor, right? The answer to that is because the init method has an access to two special objects called the servlet context and servlet config, and you generally use those objects in your init method during initialization. So the reason you have a special initialization method is for the two special objects called servlet context and servlet config, which you can have access in the init method, and you do not have access to these two objects in the constructor. So that's the reason you have this special init method for your initialization stuff, right? And actually speaking, you don't even write your constructor in the servlet. It will take a default constructor implementation given by the JVM. So you know that if you don't add a constructor to your class, the JVM will put a default no argument constructor with no implementation, right? With blank constructor in your class. So the container is going to take the default implementation of the constructor, and you don't really write a constructor also in your servlet class. Okay. So the init method, do you actually override it? Possibly yes. If there is any kind of initialization code you want to perform in your servlet, you override the init method. Else you do not override, right? Next, the service method. When is it called? The service method is called for every request that comes in for that particular servlet. So if there is a Yahoo login servlet, every time a person makes a request to this Yahoo login servlet, the service method of this Yahoo login servlet is called, right? What is it used for? This is used to determine which HTTP method should be called, right? The HTTP get or post. And do you override this? No, very unlikely, because the only thing that this service method is going to do is determine the HTTP method, the right HTTP method to invoke on your servlet class based on the type of request the client has sent. So you don't really need to override it. Whatever functionality is required for the service method is already present in the HTTP servlet, and you do not actually need to override this service method. Okay. Next, the do get or do post method. So basically these are the two methods where you put all your business logic. If the type of request was get, you override the do get method. If your type of request was a post, you override the do post method, right? And this is the place where you put all your business logic. And when it is called by the service method based on the type of the request, and you put in your business logic here. And do you override this method? Yes, obviously yes, because you have written your servlet to provide some business logic, some dynamic logic to be presented to the end user, right? And the only place you can put in your business logic is in the do get or the do post method, right? And basically from the do get method you actually even call other classes and other methods, so that your business logic is not in a single place, right? It's spread across multiple classes, and it's easier to understand and maintain. Okay, right. And you also have the destroy method, which is called by the servlet when the session times out, when there's a timeout, or the servlet is no longer required. The container calls it destroy method. Okay. Alright. So we have actually talked that the web container provides multi-threading support for the servlets, right? So let's have a detailed look at how that is implemented. So let's take the example where you log into yahoomail.com and you send in your email, username and password, and the Yahoo Mail servlet will actually give you back your inbox with all your messages, right? So let's say client A logs on to Yahoo Mail and sends in the username as ABC. So what the container does, the container spawns a thread A for this client A and pass in the request as ABC to this thread A, right? Now at the same time client B makes a request to the Yahoo servlet passing the username as XYZ. So the container will now spawn another thread called thread B for this client B, and pass the request XYZ to the thread B. So thread A will process this request ABC, create a response for that, and send back the response to the client A. In similar fashion, thread B will take in this request XYZ, create a response, process the request, and create the response for XYZ and send in the response to client B. So one thing to note that here is these are two different threads are spawned, but the request and response objects are different. They do not share the same request and response object, right? So thread A has got its own request object, and thread B also has got its own request and response object. So basically this is how multi-threading works, right, for a servlet. Okay, alright. So we've been discussing a lot about the get and the post methods. We have seen that when the type of request from the client is get, it calls do get. When the type of request is post, it calls do post. But the big question is, when do you go for a get and when do you go for a post? Okay. So I'm just going to talk about the differences between get and post here, which will ultimately let us understand when can we use a get and when do you have to go for a post. Okay. So basically, when you use a get method, a get HTTP request only has a request line and a HTTP header. Okay. Whereas a post has a request line, HTTP header, and also has a HTTP body. Okay. Parameter passing. So we've seen that when you type in your Yahoo Mail, you try to get your emails, right? And you pass in the username and password in that Yahoo Mail screen, login screen. So how are these username and password passed to the server? We've seen that these are passed in the form parameters or the form elements, right, of the request. So when you are going for a get, these form elements are appended to the end of the URL. So whatever URL you are sending, the form parameters are appended to that URL and sent it across to the server. So the form parameters, whatever information you are passing to the server, is visible in the URL when you are going for a get. But in the case of post, the form parameters is passed in the HTTP body. You've seen that post has HTTP body, and this HTTP body is not seen by anyone, right? This is a secret HTTP body which cannot be seen. So the form parameters are here sent in the HTTP body and not in the URL, which can be seen by everyone, right? Number 3, the size. So although you can send information using get, appending it to the end of the URL, the amount of data you can send using a get is limited. So you can send very less amount of data when you implement a get. But whereas in a post you can send huge amount of data because you send the data in the HTTP body and not on the request line. Okay. So ultimately, when should you use a get and when should you use a post? So the basic thumb rule is, whenever you want to fetch something from the server, you go for a get. And when you want to post something to the server, you go for a HTTP post, right? So now let's take a simple example. You want to search for servlets in Google search. So you go to google.com and you type in servlets in the search text there and you type on search. So the server actually gets you back with all the search results for the term servlets. So here you're trying to fetch something from the servlet, right? So in this case, you should be using a get, HTTP get, right? Now take another example where you are filling an online application form, wherein you enter lots of fields and whatnot, and then submit that form to the server, right? So in this case, you're actually filling up some form and you're submitting this data to the server. You're submitting this information to the server. So when you want to submit something to the server, you use a post. You go for a post, right? So the basic thumb rule is, when you want to fetch something from the server, go for a get. When you want to post something to the server, go for a post. But there's one more condition to this. You know that using get, you can pass some parameters to the server as well. But if the amount of parameters, the type of parameters you're sending is sensitive, then even though the amount of parameters you're sending is less, you should go for a post. Now let me say an example. You're trying to get your emails. So you pass in the username and password in the Yahoo logon screen and click on go to my email, right? Log on button. So that will actually get you all your messages for your particular email address. So here, even though you're trying to get something from the server, you're trying to get your emails from the server, you should be using a post. Why? Because the type of information you're sending is sensitive information. When you go for a get, the username and password would have been appended to the end of the URL and sent it across to a server. and everyone can actually see this username and password, right? And you don't want anyone to see what the username and password you are using. So this information is sensitive, and for all sensitive transactions, whatever the amount of data is, whatever type of transaction you are doing, get or fetch, you should definitely use a HTTP post method, because in the post the data is sent in the HTTP body, which cannot be seen by anyone, right? So I think that makes it clear when to use a get and when to use a post. Alright, now let's talk something about the response. So we know that when you send in a request to a servlet, the web container calls that servlet's methods, and the servlet sends back the response to the client. But now assume that the servlet does not have the ability to serve the request of the client. What happens? Now, so we have already seen this flow. Request comes in, the servlet can serve the request, yes, it sends a resource back to the client. Now let's see what is this flow. No, the servlet cannot serve the request. Now what happens? What happens in this part of the flow? Okay. Now let's take an example. I've created a website called abc.com. Okay, and I've got a lot of users on that website now. And after a year or so, I decide that I want to change my name. I want to change the name of the website. I want to change it to some xyz.com, because I don't find abc.com very exciting now. So I changed the name to xyz.com. But again, I've developed a lot of clients over this year, and I don't want all of those clients, I don't want to lose those clients, right? So what I want to do is, now my ABC servlet cannot serve the request for the clients, but whenever a request comes to abc.com servlet, I want the request to be redirected to XYZ servlet. So I don't want the client to like get an error page or something like that, right? Because I know that ABC servlet cannot serve the request, but I know that XYZ servlet can serve the request, and I want people to actually talk to the XYZ servlet now instead of ABC servlet. So what happens here? Let's see. So my ABC servlet cannot serve the request, but does the servlet know who can serve the request? Yes, it knows that XYZ servlet can serve the request. So it now sends the response back to the client. It talks to XYZ servlet and sends the required response back to the client. Okay, so there are two ways in which this can do. It can do it. It can use either send redirect or request dispatcher. Okay, now let's talk about the difference between these two. What is the difference between send redirect and request dispatcher? Okay, now in this example of abc.com to xyz.com, what actually the servlet does when you go for a send redirect? When you implement a send redirect, the servlet actually sends back a response to the client, and the client here is nothing but the web browser. So the servlet sends back a response to the web browser saying that it cannot serve the request, but it knows that xyz.com can serve the request. Please send a request back to xyz.com. So now the web browser now gets this response from servlet ABC and sends another request to servlet XYZ, and ultimately gets the resource from XYZ servlet. So you, being an end client, really don't know. You don't know that a response had come back from ABC and the web browser has again sent another request to XYZ. You don't know that these two-step processes happened. From your perspective, the end client perspective, you only see that you typed in abc.com and you got some response, but you don't know that this two-step process had taken place, right? So that is send redirect. What happens in request dispatcher? In request dispatcher, basically the servlet itself, the ABC servlet itself will forward the request to XYZ servlet, and the response is sent back to XYZ servlet, to the client, right? So here there is no failure response sent back to the browser, and the browser doesn't send back another request to the XYZ servlet, but the ABC servlet itself forwards the request to XYZ servlet, and XYZ servlet forwards the response to the client. So that is request dispatcher. So when should you use a send redirect and when should you use a request dispatcher? So basically you can use request dispatcher only when the other servlet which can serve the request of the client lies in the same web application. If the other servlet is in the same web application, only in that scenario you can use a request dispatcher. But if the other servlet is outside this web application, it lives outside this web application, it lives in some other web application, then you have to use a send redirect, because it has to make another request and it cannot really communicate with the other servlet which lies outside this web application. Okay, and ultimately if the servlet ABC doesn't really know who can serve the request sent by the client, it simply sends an error page to the client, right? So I hope the difference between the send redirect and request dispatcher is clear, right? You will be using this quite a few times when you develop your servlet applications. Okay, all right. So earlier we have discussed that in the init method of the servlet has got access to two special objects called the servlet context and servlet config, right? Okay, so let's have a look at how that looks. The servlet context is an object. It's a Java object basically, the servlet context and as well as the servlet config. The servlet context is only one per the whole web application. So for the whole web application you've got only one servlet context, and servlet config is one per servlet or JSPs, right? So all the servlets in the application access the same servlet context, but each servlet has got its own servlet config object, right? So this is one important thing you'll have to make a note of. So if you are accessing something from the servlet context, you know that each and every servlet has got access to this servlet context object, but servlet 2 doesn't have access to servlet config object of servlet 1. It has only got access to its own servlet config object. Okay. Right. So what can you do basically with the context and config objects? So one thing you can definitely do is fetch your initialization parameters. So what are init parameters? So we've seen previously in the web.xml slide that you have a web app element, and within that you have a number of servlet and servlet mapping elements, right? And I did tell you that apart from the servlet and servlet mapping elements, you will have a number of other elements as well in the web.xml within the web app element, right? So one of those are the init parameter elements. So init parameter elements, basically whatever initialization parameters you want to put in your servlets or your apps, basically you can put that initialization parameter value in the web.xml in the init parameter tag, right? So say for example you want to store the path to the data source URL, right? You can put that data source URL in this init parameter element now. So you can put init parameter and you can give a parameter name data source. So you start the data source tag, put the value for the data source, and you close the data source tag, right? Okay. So we have two types of init parameters here. We've got context init parameters and we've got servlet init parameter. Let's discuss the difference between these two. So number one, the difference is the scope. So we've seen that the context is one per application, whereas a servlet is one per servlet. So the scope for a context init parameter typically becomes the web container, the whole web container, whereas the scope for an init parameter is specific to the servlet or JSP, whichever servlet within which you write the init parameter. So basically when you write an init parameter for a context init parameter, you put it under the main web app element and you do not put it inside any servlet element tag. But when you are writing an init parameter for a servlet, you have to put it within a servlet element tag. Okay. Now, how do you get the init parameter value in your servlet code or your init method, right? So the code you write to get the init parameter is get servlet context. So you basically call this method called get servlet context and again call the method on. So this is going to return you the context object, and on that context object you say context object dot get init parameter value, right? Similarly, for servlet you say get servlet config. So this will give you the config object, instance of the config object, on which you can call the init parameter. Next, the deployment descriptor. So as I've told you, this goes directly within the web app element and not within any specific servlet element. But whereas for a servlet init parameter, the entry goes into the servlet element. So whatever servlet you want the init parameter to be available, you put this init parameter entry in that particular servlet element. Okay. All right. Now, so we've got one more thing called attributes, wherein you can store and retrieve data using attributes as well. So what is the difference between attributes and parameters? We've just seen that using parameters you can store data, you can store some data and you can retrieve that data in your servlet code. And again I'm saying that you have attributes wherein you can store and retrieve data. So what's the difference between attributes and the parameters, initialization parameters? Number one, so what are the types of attributes you can have? You can have context attributes, you can have request attributes, you can have session attributes. So this says nothing but about the life of the attributes. Okay, so context attribute basically can be accessed throughout the whole web application, whereas a request attribute is only available for that particular request, and a session attribute is valid until the session is live. So in that particular session only you can access this session attribute. Okay, coming to parameters, you've got only two, right? You've got this context parameter and you've got a servlet init parameter. So there are only two types of parameters you have. So what are the methods by which you can set a value to an attribute? So you've got the set attribute method, and you can, this is basically similar to a hash map where you put a value to a hash map using a key value pair, right? So the key is nothing but the first parameter, the string, and the second parameter is nothing but the value which you set to that attribute. That's the actual object you want to store, right, in the attribute. So basically, on what object do you call the set attribute method? You either call it on the session object or the request object, right, or the context object. So basically you can set a value to the attributes using this key value functionality. Coming to parameters, how do you set a value to initialization parameters? So you cannot dynamically set a value to the initialization parameter in your servlet code. So this is one big difference you have to note. You can only set the value to initialization parameter once, and that is only at the time of the web.xml. Only at the time when you write the web.xml you can put in the value for that initialization parameter, right, in the web.xml. So if you have some attribute value which changes often, say you want to set a value now and later on again the value can change and you want to set that another value into that attribute, so you cannot do that using parameters. You can only do that using attributes, because this is only one time process, parameters, at web.xml at deployment time. But whereas attributes, you can get and set the values any number of times. Okay, now the return type of attributes. So the return type of attribute is an object. So basically you can store any type of object in the attribute, right? So you can set any object to the attribute and you basically retrieve that object from the attribute. Whereas the return type for a parameter is a string. Okay, so you can store only strings in a parameter. So that's another big difference between attributes and parameters. If you want to store anything apart from a string, you cannot do that using parameters, initialization parameters, even though they are like, even though if you want to set that value only once throughout the life of the servlet, you cannot do that using parameters because it's a string. If there is an object you need to store, you'll have to do it via attributes, and you cannot do that using parameters, right? So the method to get the attribute or parameter values, for attribute you use the get attribute method, again which you call on the either on context, request or session object, whereas the for parameters, to get the value of the parameter, you call the get init parameter value, passing the parameter init parameter key name, and you call this on the servlet context or the servlet config objects, right? So this is basically the difference between attributes and parameters. So if you want to put in something which is only used once throughout the application, you can use, and if that is a string, you can use a init parameter. But if there is something which can change frequently and which is not an object, you go for a attributes, right?